Now, we're not going to be having any PA system, so if those behind can't hear, just wave your hands and I'll try to speak louder and make myself clearer, yeah? But so far, okay? Okay. Now, when I was asked whether I'd like to give a talk to your forum or your association, I was asked to speak about basically the Malaysian elections and the culture of Malaysian elections. So we came out with the title of God, King and Racism. Now, some of you may not be aware, Cambridge was the headquarters for Parliament's forces during the English Civil War. They operated from Cambridge, and Oxford was where the Royalists were, King Charles' army. And King Charles was more aligned or more sympathetic towards the Catholics, and the Parliament forces were more inclined towards the Puritans, the Protestants. And the rallying call was for God, King, and country. So both sides thought that they were fighting a noble war, a war for God, King, and country. And what better place than to use Cambridge to talk about Malaysia's version of God, King, and country, which is God, King, and racism. And that's because Ketuanan Melayu is very much part of Malaysian political culture, very much, well, according to what politicians say, very much part of our constitution, the constitution of Malaysia, which used to be the constitution of Malaya. Now, Britain gave us a constitution. Britain itself does not have a written constitution. It's more like a living constitution. It evolves. But the written constitution per se, as we have in Malaya or Malaysia now, does not exist. And how do we interpret the constitution and interpret the different races that come under the constitution, interpret Islam within the constitution? This has been a very vague, a very grey area, which we must blame the British for. Because the British wrote it into the constitution without explaining properly how we interpret it. And that's why we need lawyers. Lawyers come in to interpret grey areas. When we disagree on the letter of the law, or the spirit of the law, then the lawyers will come in, make a lot of money charging us to interpret. How many of you are law students here? You know, among your contemporaries was Tunku Abdul Rahman, our first Prime Minister, studied law here. He took 7 years. And that made him the Prime Minister. He never became a lawyer. Those of you who are going to be here only 3 years will have to become a lawyer, not the Prime Minister. Yeah? Now, when we talk about Malaysian politics, the campaign during the election, the party manifesto, everything, the element of religion, the element of Ketuanan Melayu, racism, and the element of the position of the rulers. Because what a constitution monarchy. You can't avoid this. And Malaysian elections has always been about division of race as well as division of religion. However, many of us who were born after the Merdeka, I'm sure most of you were born after the Merdeka, some of you were probably born after 1969 as well, you would not understand the birth of the nation, how we became a nation state, the route that we took, the process that we went through to reach where we are today. Who were the people instrumental in bringing us to where we are today? And who were the real fighters for Merdeka? Now, if you have studied history, since maybe what, the 1970s maybe, yeah? Or the 1980s. If you have studied history in Malaysian schools, you would have been given the propaganda version of history. It is what the government wants you to think, what the government tells you. But is this the real history of Malaya? Is this what really happened? I don't think any of you read Joginda Singh Jesse, did you? In school, secondary school. I don't think you read Swettenham, Wilkinson, Winston. These are the original historians. Along the way, Dewan Mahasiswa dan Pustaka came up with new versions of history books. And I was told, but I have not seen it, I was told by some parents who were going through their children's history books. And they said the history of Malaya started in 1946. And 1946 was when UMNO was born. So the history of Malaya started when UMNO started. And UMNO was the fighter for independence. We fought the British, we got independence. We didn't fight anybody. Okay, maybe some UMNO leaders sat around a table having beer with the British to discuss who's going to be which minister and all. But that's about it. And then they went to BB Park for the older generation, remember? You see, our older generation is smiling. They went to BB Park and went to Joget, and that was it. But there was no fight, there was no bloodshed, there was no guns, there was nothing. So what? Perjuangan, struggle, revolution, fight for merdeka. What are you referring to? The real fight started during the Second World War. During the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded Malaya in 1941, some Malays got together. And these are Malays like Pak Sako, Mustafa Hussein, Ibrahim Yaakob. These are the early Malay nationalists. And we had Chinese nationalists. And those Chinese nationalists are people like Chin Peng. Now why do I call him a Malay nationalist? Because he wanted to fight for the independence of Malaya. The fact that he was standing on the platform of the Communist Party is secondary. Everybody was a communist back in the 40s. It was fashionable. It was shit to be a communist. Ibrahim Yaakob was socialist. Samsia Fakir, communist. Even Pak Sako, who today is celebrated as one of the greatest Malay writers, was a socialist back in those days. Now, I recommend a book. The Memoirs of Mustafa Hussein, 1910 to 1957, Malay Nationalism Before UMNO. Now, this relates the journey of Malay nationalism long before UMNO was born, long even before the idea of UMNO ever came about. And how the Malay nationalists got together to support the Japanese. Because the Japanese came to Malaya in 1941 to free the country of Western imperialism. And the Western imperialists had dominated all the countries of Southeast Asia except Thailand and most parts of China, especially the southern part of China, Guangzhou, even in Shanghai. Shanghai was divided between so many imperialists. Until today, you can still see the imperialist buildings. Now, in this book, it relates the negotiation, the journey the Malay nationalists had with the Japanese to jointly declare Merdeka for Malaya. The Malayan history books, those history books written and taught in Malaysia, will tell you the date of Merdeka. When was the date of Merdeka? 31st August 1957. We fly the flag. But you know, Merdeka was supposed to have happened on 17th August 1945. That was the first date of Merdeka. And that was the date agreed by the Japanese. And the Japanese agreed on the Merdeka date, 17th August 1945, because Malaya had been free of British colonialism. And the Japanese, or the Japanese military administrators of Malaya, had agreed with the Malayan nationalists that we shall now give your country Merdeka. Unfortunately, on 6th August, the Americans bombed Hiroshima. On the 9th August, they bombed Nagasaki. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of August, Japan surrendered. Japan surrendered on 15th of August, 2 days before Merdeka was supposed to be declared on 17th of August. If the Americans had delayed 1 week, or had not bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Malaya would have been declared Merdeka on the 17th of August. Now, what happens if Malaya had been declared Merdeka on 17th August 1945? And then, a few months later, a year later, the Japanese finally surrendered. The British would come back. Like what they did in September 1945, the British would come back. When the British come back, like they did in 1945, they came back to a country that was being administrated by Japan. And Japan had lost the war. So technically, Malaya was still part of imperialist Britain. But if Malaya had been declared Merdeka in 1945, 17th of August 1945, we will be a free country, we will be an independent country. When the British come back, the British will be invading Malaya, not taking back the administration of Malaya. That means we will have to fight the British to keep them out, just like what they did, just like what the Indonesians did with the Dutch. When the Dutch tried to come back, they fought. And the Filipinos did also with the Spanish. When they tried to come back, they fought. So the Filipinos fought the Spanish, the Indonesians fought the Dutch, the Malays, welcome balik tuan. Your house is ready for you. So in the 2 weeks after the end of the war, we prepared the grounds for the British to come back and take over the country, continue running the country now that the Japanese have gone home. People like Mustafa Hussein, Ibrahim Yaakob, Ishak Haji Muhammad, Chin Peng, and many others, they resisted the British occupation. They wanted independence for Malaya. But one thing they couldn't agree on, all these various political groups, all the different political groups, one thing they couldn't agree on are the terms of Merdeka. If the Malays, the Indians, the Chinese, the Sikhs, and the others, Sabah, Sarawak, Singapore was not involved yet at that time, if the others get together and negotiate Merdeka with the British, what form of government are we going to have? But you see, all these were radicals. All these people were radicals. I would say they were extremists, but they were fighters. These are the people who are prepared to take up arms and fight if necessary. So when you get this bunch of people banging tables and, you know, very vocal, very committed and very uncompromising. They couldn't come to an agreement. And finally, after a few conferences, after a few meetings, they just couldn't decide what's the form of, you know, the nationhood that we're seeking, what's it going to be. The British realized that if we allow these people to continue talking, finally they'll come to some sort of agreement, some sort of compromise. And this compromise that they'll come to, the agreement that they'll come to, will exclude the British. We will want the British out. The British have robbed the country long enough. Whatever is left, we nationalize everything. And don't forget here, at that time, Britain was almost bankrupt. They spent all this money on the war. And 30% of Britain's economy depended on Malaya, our kid and rubber. 30% of the economy. And that's not a small figure. The British have to make sure that this group does not take over. We must get another group to take over. And this other group that takes over must leave the British interests alone. In other words, you take over the country, you run the administration, okay? But leave our money alone.